But I will thank you, anyway, for putting this together. When I first came to BTI, the faculty were responsible for an annual retreat, which meant it occasionally got done and not very well. So ever since PGS has assumed that responsibility, it's 1,000 times better. And I know it's a lot of work. I know it's sometimes a struggle to get people motivated. And you just have to believe in yourselves. And this year it feels different. Maybe it's the venue, maybe it's the way the schedule was organized, but I'm really glad you do it, and I think the faculty are really glad you do it. A lot of them were here today. Maybe more of them should have been, but you should take some pride in that. So I was asked to talk about two things. One was, again, briefly, one was the concept of integrating omics and discovery, if I can call it that, and the second was, what about the PGS? Do they have a role to play? So just a couple of thoughts. So integration is a word that's used in many different ways. In the last talk, for example, I think it was used in what I would call a relatively narrow sense of taking a few data sets and having them work together. And that's an important thing. You have to be able to integrate your northern blots and your western blots. That's not what I'm here to talk about, I don't think. I think the question is really about the scale of the integration. So for example, if you're integrating genomics and some kind of discovery or biological question, is one simply doing omics, maybe to assume you'll find a pattern. So this is the idea where the data generation comes before the hypothesis. We hope a hypothesis will come out. Or is a biological question that we don't understand is fishing for answers. We just turn the crank on all the omics and hope that the answer pops out as to why something works the way it does. And I don't think either one of those approaches is really integration, and for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't really value both the partners in that process, and it doesn't really make a whole that's usually much greater than the sum of the parts. So you end up with some data sets and some other results, and you don't really have a greater understanding. And I think there's a subtext to this that I hear all the time from people is that what some people call integration is really to one person feels they're being treated as a service provider of some kind, and the other person is doing the real science. So, a true integration is where the value systems are both present in the project, and that project is going to come to a better fruition. And so I'm going to come back to that kind of hazy concept in a moment. One reason I was late today is because I was on a call with NSF. And now NSF is just done a couple of town hall meetings the last few days on what they call reintegrating biology. Of course, I'm interested in reintegrating plant biology. And so in these two webinars, or they're kind of interactive town halls, about 400 people participated. The one I was on yesterday had about 180. And it was presaged by development of big questions. So people deposited big questions in a Google Doc, and you can imagine, how many phenotypes are possible in a plant, or what does the microbiome do? These kind of big questions are out there, fairly easy for us to ask. We kind of know what we don't know. What we don't know is how to figure it out. So we can ask the question, how do we get the answer? And so what NSF believes is important in this reintegration initiative is in part finding the questions, but it's really creating a research culture that is positioned to answer those questions. And for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, is that disciplines know that each other's exist, but the siloing of biology is real. And it can occur on the same floor of one building, it occurs between departments, it occurs across institutions. And the siloing tends to make us regard ourselves as individuals and not as part of a collective. And since the integrative questions, the truly integrative questions, have to be answered across disciplines, the question becomes how to get disciplines to really work together. And my understanding is that, and you could probably take this to the bank, is that NSF is about to announce a request for proposals for several kinds of what they're calling integration institutes. Integration institutes are going to be designed in certain ways by proposers to help people learn to work across disciplines in a productive way, and not to have a value that a person who does omics, for example, is just turning the crank, or a person who invents a cool technology gets up in the morning to serve their project. It doesn't work that way. An engineer who builds sensors doesn't get up in the morning to make you and you figure out how your plant grows better. They're interested in sensors for other reasons. So you need to value them, and they need to value you and your culture. And the more different disciplines you bring together, the more complicated but ultimately fruitful that integration of value systems becomes. So the question is really, is BTI an integration institute? Is NSF, would they look at us as one? Or what would it take to turn us into one? Or do we want to become one? I think those are really important questions for the future. And it'll be interesting to see what NSF really has in mind when the chapter and verse of the I believe the lawyers still have the official announcements, but they'll be out very soon. I was asked to comment on whether the cluster hire plays into this. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. For one thing, the clusters had big questions. I mean, this was their jobs. They didn't get hired without coming up with some big questions, and the questions would cut across disciplines. But because, so Magda, who's coming in March, always used the term cluster buddies. And this idea that your fellow faculty or your buddies is really different than that your colleagues, who you hope will also succeed in whatever they're doing, but they better not step on your toes. It's more of a feeling from day one that there's a cohort of people coming in who together are going to make a whole that's greater than some of the parts, and they value each other right from the beginning of the interview process. So ultimately, perhaps, cluster hires or the derivatives, the next thing we try to do, will change culture at the organization. It'd be good for plant science. I think it'd be good for the Institute. I think it'd be good for inviting people into plant science careers who are not rugged individualists. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the coming years. Now, my comments to the PGS, what about us, or what do we have to do with this all? Well, of course, you're doing most of the science, so that's something right there. And you're the people who are going to, form the cultures of the future, either here or in other organizations. And what kind of cultural tools you develop and how you employ them is going to be super important, going forward. So, my question to the PGS is, as you sort of reimagine or reinvent yourselves, I think you're on your way, how do you think BTI culture should evolve? What do you think it should be? What incentives, what goals would it take to make us more diverse, more cooperative, more team-like, more integrated, really? What would the walls look like, or would we have any walls? If we could rebuild the Institute from the ground up, what would it look like? These are the kind of vision and infrastructure questions that we're going to ask ourselves in the coming, let's say 5 to 10 years, and hopefully remodel the building to be in accord with our beliefs. So I would also say, I often hear this from earlier career audiences. They say, well, you all, the people with gray hair, you're the ones who need to make the change because you're the power structure. What can we do? And I say to them, I used to have gray hair, and I probably said the same thing. But time passes, and those of you who are earlier career today will be later career later. That's how it goes. And you need to believe in yourselves as agents of change. And I had this conversation down at NSF a few weeks ago, the genome meeting. Faye, you were there, and one of the program officers said, you can't have big ideas never get implemented. Just forget it and be a realist. The status quo is going to rule. And I think, if you look at the status quo today and how it was 10 years ago, they don't look anything like each other. So change does happen. And the question is who promotes it and what is it going to look like? And everybody has a role to play. And I will say that, over the last 10 years or so that I've been working with a larger plant community to talk about the future, the best ideas usually come from the earliest career people. They don't believe that the status quo is inevitable. They don't even know what that really even means. They haven't learned their Latin yet. So they don't have the preconceptions and sort of hardened beliefs that the people accumulate during their careers. So I do think the early career people have an awful lot to give. Yes, you're busy with all the other things. You may have a family, you may have a project. Who has time for the institution and the culture? Well, I tell you, it pays off in many ways over the course of a career. It'll make it more satisfying and more productive, in my opinion. And so I just end by, I asked myself a question as I was taking these notes. What if I like being an individualist? Everybody thinks about Mendel as maybe that Mendel was an individualist, although I learned that wasn't true. I got corrected by someone who knew a lot more about it than I did. The people around him never get any credit. That's the problem. But, can science be an individual pursuit, or do we just drum all those folks out and say, you're not singing Kumbaya and playing team ball here? So shouldn't you have a big tent? Shouldn't you welcome people who want to be judged as individuals and work on their favorite project and actually live in a silo? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't think that all styles of science, there's only one style of science that works. I think there should be a mix of styles and a mix of perspectives, that's for sure. We wouldn't have much diversity. We don't have enough as it is. But what happens when you mix individualists and team people together? How do you develop metrics, merit, incentives, and so on that accommodate all those different styles? I think that's part of the puzzle of creating an institute, you know, and maintaining and evolving an institute. So I just leave you with that thought, and I hope that the PGS stays engaged on those issues in the years to come. That's it.